Welcome back to Business Talk, and time to talk about what everyone loves talking about, the Rand. And South African investors are waking up to something that we haven't seen in many, many years, a genuinely strong currency at around 15 Rand 70 to the dollar at one point recently. But we are now back near around 16 in the last few days, but certainly back at levels last seen more than 3 years ago. We know precious metals are booming, the dollar has softened, and suddenly sentiment around South Africa feels, dare I say it, constructive. But here's the question. When the Rand strengthens like this, should you change your investment strategy? Do you now rush money offshore? Do you rotate into domestic shares or just ignore the noise entirely? Well, join me to unpack what a strong Rand really means for investors and whether you should adjust your portfolio is Wendy Myers, head of PSG Securities. Wendy, welcome back. And isn't it fantastic to see a strong Rand? It feeds into so much confidence in South Africa. But before we get tactical, maybe let's zoom out. Because the Rand, the nickname is the Rattler, because it can turn around and bite you. It's volatile. What are the key forces that really drive our currency?
Yeah, I think, it's wonderful, Michael, to have a strong Rand. I think there's so much about investing that's emotional. And when you have a Rand that's performing, everything seems to be on the up. Everything's positive. So I think it's important for investors to understand that the Rand is a very liquid emerging market. It's very sensitive to global risk sentiment, commodity price fluctuations, and domestic political instability obviously impacted, right? So we've had magnificent returns on our commodity stocks. So it's important to understand that has a very positive impact on the Rand. Now, the Rand, I think it's important for investors to understand that it tends to be a risk-on, risk-off currency. And it's important to understand that concept in the context of choosing your investments. I think simplistically, in a risk-on environment, investors tend to switch from developed markets to emerging markets. Now, that obviously depresses the developed market asset prices, which I do think we're starting to see in the States to a degree, and it strengthens the emerging market asset prices. Obviously the Rand is the beneficiary of that. So, but in the converse, in a risk-off environment, then obviously the reverse is true. Investors are moving their allocation. If there's political instability, as an example, in South Africa, or there's Eskom issues, then people are nervous about being long the Rand. So they move their money to developed markets, and that then drives, obviously, it enhances the weakness of the Rand. So I think that's important for advisors, for investors to understand the difference between risk on and risk off. But to answer your question, what are the key drivers of ZAR volatility? Global risk sentiment, I think, is the key thing that I've spoken about. This risk on, risk off mindset, and the Rand being as volatile as it is, and actually being one of the highest traded emerging market currencies, it tends to move quickly. So I think that's important for investors to understand. We know about the commodity price dependency. We are, as a country, some of us talk about South Africa being a mining town because we are so heavily dependent on commodity prices and what it means for our Rand strength. And I've spoken about it, political, economic uncertainty, when there's policy changes and there's increasing in interest rates, all of this stuff leads to concerns from an investing perspective. So political developments from an ANC government change perspective, if there's policy uncertainty, structural issues, I've mentioned Eskom, our sovereign debt ratings, all of that has a material impact on the ZAR and how it's perceived. It's highly liquid. I said just now that, the Rand is probably the most traded emerging market currency. And then if there's key changes in US economic policy, you would think it wouldn't impact us, but it does. I think we've seen with the Trump administration, there's been big changes there, and that's led to dollar weakness. And so as a result, it's driven a strength in the Rand, which has been lovely to see.
Yeah. And also, that differential that we see in interest rates between ourselves and the US and what real rates are trading at, again, can support the currency. If you have a very attractive real rate, that difference between inflation and where The SARB puts interest rates, and I know the SARB wants to do away with repo, but where the SARB sets the real rate, then that can often be very attractive if you're trading in and out, as you say, in a volatile currency. Those can be very fickle. It's not like you're going in and you're buying a factory. You're trading in and out. And I think that it heightens that volatility. And if we accept that the rand is cyclical and sentiment driven, it certainly has big implications for how we think about offshore investing. So let's look at the rand versus the JSE, because there's often talk of an inverse relationship between the rand and the JSE. Is that actually accurate?
Yeah, I think there's generally a correlation between the strength of the rand and the overall performance of JSE shares. And that's because a large portion of the top 40 consists of companies that earn their revenue in dollars. So obviously, look at Naspers. I think if you want to take a local stock that's listed, the recent performance, I think it's down 20% year to date, because its revenue in dollar terms, it's getting less rands. There's definitely an inverse relationship between the rand and all share index. Stronger rand puts pressure on the index. It reduces rand denominated value of international earnings, like I've said. Whereas a weaker rand actually causes the JSE to rise. So it works in the inverse, and it's important for investors to understand that correlation. So I think rand hedges, resources, globally diversified companies like Richemont, Naspers, like I've mentioned, they underperform when the rand strengthens because their foreign profits are worth less in rand terms. But then you've got domestically oriented shares, think local retailers and the banks. The banks have had an incredible run, and property companies, and they definitely benefit from a stronger rand. Because it lowers inflation, lowers interest, so obviously the consumer is stronger, and it lowers input costs, and it allows supports lower interest rates, and then the consumer spending can stand out without significant consumer debt. So I think what stands out for me, this inverse relationship generally holds true, but what we're seeing in 2025, 26 is, the market always likes to surprise us. And it's shown that actually the rand and JSE strength actually have been stronger together, which is a new concept that we haven't seen. Yeah, it's unusual. We haven't seen that for some time, I must say.
Yeah. And
but
it
it's
makes
nice.
sense. It makes absolute sense that, if you've got a strong rand, and we often talk about rand hedge stocks, and we say, what is it? Something like, 40% of the companies listed on the JSE derive the majority of the earnings offshore. So you're getting that offshore diversification anyway because of that. But it makes sense that a strong rand effectively compresses the rand value of those foreign earnings. And then on the flip side, as you say, then, the retailers, the banks responding differently from, say, maybe miners and global luxury plays. It's so interesting, though, that in the last couple of years, we've seen both the rand and the JSE strengthening together, largely because I think of those surging metals prices. But it is certainly a reminder that correlations are helpful, but they're never guaranteed in markets.
No, they're not. You're right, Michael.
Let's just assume quickly that investors use this strength to move money offshore, because often we talk about going offshore as a strategic move. It shouldn't be, I'm going offshore because the currency is weak or the currency is strong. You're tapping that universe of listed equities out there with we're less than 1% of. It makes sense that you go offshore when the rand is a bit stronger, though. If the dollar weakens, what does that typically mean for US equities?
Yeah. So, as investors, when we see a strong rand, we think, oh, this is fantastic. I can now invest in offshore equities. But often, if it's a weak dollar, then the stock prices overseas have often increased to compensate for that weak dollar. Because obviously, overseas companies they're more favorable from a dollar pricing perspective overseas, so their exports are rising. So when South African investors capitalizing on a strong rand and getting more dollars for their rands, the overseas prices have often run. So then they're often entering those overseas prices at a higher entry point. So I think it's something that's quite important for investors to understand. But But I think what are the key impacts of a weak dollar and what does it mean for dollar listed shares? It's important for investors to understand. Once you've placed your money offshore, you need to understand that a weak dollar boosts multinational earnings. So US companies, as I've said, in the S&P 500, they're getting more revenue for their exports. Obviously, it encourages international investment. So people are going to want to invest more in the States because they can get more for their foreign currency. Obviously, it supports commodities. The commodities being priced in dollars typically rise when the dollar weakens. And then export competitiveness, like I've said. So I think those are the four key impacts that an investor must realize when they are using the strong rand to invest in dollar listed shares.
So, yeah, I mean, effectively, the currency then cuts both ways because it affects your entry levels, but also the asset performance once you're invested. So, and it's interesting, it gives with the one hand and maybe takes with the other. Let's get a bit practical. What are the real advantages of a strong rand for South African investors? How do investors actually benefit in the strong rand environment?
Yeah, I think it's important that a lot of investors are nervous about investing overseas. And I think this is the time to really look. There's a lot of volatility, especially in American markets, although we are seeing some good returns out of Europe. But I do think it's important. Investors need to adopt that global mindset. They need to understand that there needs to be some kind of hedge for ZAR performance for the long term. So to me, this is the perfect opportunity to invest offshore, but obviously be aware of the risks. I think the key benefits for South African investors, understand that offshore investing is cheaper given the stronger currency. Be aware that we've got reduced imports. So that, reduced import costs. I think that's important. If you want to invest locally in SA retailers and manufacturers, then their profitability will go up. It's important for I think investors to understand the impact on inflation and interest rates. If we've got a strong rand, it lowers the cost of imports. So things are more affordable for SA investors. Fuel costs that drive inflation is going to be a lot cheaper. And then obviously the benefit is it boosts domestic stocks. So investors that have, I think, maybe sat on the sidelines when interest rates were high, if they're not interested or too anxious about investing in overseas markets, this is the perfect opportunity to put some money in the local market and stay invested for the long term and benefit from those good quality companies. I mean, if it was me, what steps would I take given the current climate? I would use the rand strength now to build a more resilient portfolio considering geography. So both local and offshore. I think Europe's got a lot of opportunities there. And I think with the volatility we've seen in the States, there might be some good entry levels. I think that the AI stocks have certainly come off quite a bit. Identify those companies on the JSE that benefit from a stronger rand. We've seen it. Manufacturers and retailers in particular. Look at gold. It's a highly volatile stock, so it's not for the faint-hearted. But think of it as a hedge, providing protection against future currency weakness. And then what we always say, look at the full context of your investments, look at your entire portfolio and rebalance it accordingly. Use stronger exchange rates to correct any underweight positions in international assets. That's what I think this opportunity provides SA investors. But I think it's important to note, the stronger rand obviously it offers opportunities. It can negatively impact local companies. Those companies like an Naspers that rely on exported goods. Consider that because it might be a good entry point now, but if you've already held those companies, and obviously those prices are a bit depressed at the moment. But obviously, we take a long-term approach when it comes to investing.
So that said, given all of this information, how should we change our approach to investing, if at all?
Well, I think, Michael, it's never about the entry level. I think as investors, because we're emotional, we always think, oh, I've got to buy in at the bottom and I've got to sell at the top. it's important about around choosing those quality companies that deliver good, strong, regular dividend payments to your portfolio. Stay invested for the long term, and capitalize on those irrational and emotional and short-sighted investment decisions. Where the crowd is making these panicked, emotive responses to external stimulus. Understand that you can capitalize on that, but you want to aim to be invested in these good companies that are going to weather the storm for the long term and pay you good dividends. I think Warren Buffett has a wonderful quote. He always says, look at market fluctuations as your friend rather than your enemy, and profit from folly rather than participate in it. I think it's a lovely way of summarizing it.
It's a great quote. I love that. Discipline over drama, I think, because the rand will strengthen, the rand will weaken. I think the cycle is probably as certain as markets themselves. But the real question isn't whether the rate is at 1570 or 1770. I think it's whether your portfolio is positioned to survive both. Thank you so much, Wendy Myers, head of PSG Securities, as always, with great insight into this period of rand strength here on Business Talk. Take care and chat soon.
Thank you, Michael.